Welcome back to the Codcast. I'm Andy Metzger, reporter at Commonwealth Magazine, and I'm here with Justin Silverman, who's the executive director of the New England First Amendment Coalition, and with Representative Josh Cutler, who recently authored the book Mobtown Massacre, Alexander Hanson and the Baltimore Newspaper War of 1812. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The scene is Baltimore, probably a sweltering hot morning in July of 1812. The nation is going to war with England. There's a mob outside of a house. They've dragged a cannon. Inside the house is a local newspaper publisher and his buds armed with muskets. And fresh from his country estate, the mayor of Baltimore comes into the house. And what does he say, Representative Josh Cutler?
So, he is attempting to broker a peace between the Federalists that are secured inside the house and their Spartan band and the mob of angry men outside that basically want to silence the newspaper and kill the Federalists inside.
And what's his proposal?
So his proposal is to let the Federalists be escorted to the city jail so they can be deposited behind bars where they will ostensibly be protected from this oncoming mob. Unfortunately, they were not, and as soon as the city leaders kind of let down their guard and went back to their homes, the mob came back and struck again, and they broke into the jail. They may have had some help in some regards from a friendly jail keep, and they were able to get inside the jail into the passageways where the cells were held. And inside were a band of Federalists led by Alexander Hanson and about a dozen or so men that they referred to as their Spartan band. And the mob broke in and basically commenced a massacre, which was later described by one report as a scene of horror and murder which for its barbarity has no parallel in the history of the American people. That's a short version of what happened. What actually happened is much longer and frankly more gruesome. Hanson and his cohorts were brutally tortured. The mob used hot candle wax to drip in their eyes. They gouged the men with sticks, axes, rusty blades. Hanson was badly beaten. Some of his compatriots, including a gentleman named Lighthorse Harry Lee, who was well known as the father of Robert E. Lee, his eye was gouged out. So it was quite a brutal scene that ensued.
And his great crime was writing an editorial against the America going to war against Britain, right? And there's so much different from the 1812 Baltimore than today. It seems like people had a lot of time on their hands to just mill about and riot and with muskets, etc. But I wonder if either of you, and maybe starting with Justin, do you see any parallels between that mob and society today?
Yeah, there's certainly some parallels, but I got to mention the cannon. Having read the book, that was the scene that jumped out at me the most, because you have this group of people, this mob, that are so upset about what was published in a newspaper that they wheel a cannon across the street from the building to blow through to make their point. So we don't have mobs doing that now, and we generally don't have large mob scenes in front of newspapers every time there's a controversial editorial, for example. But to answer your question, as far as some parallels, we certainly have mobs in other senses, right? We have social media, which has given an incredible platform to a large group of people. So anytime anything is said that might be controversial, we all have the ability to go on social media, form our own online mob, and while we might not be using cannons or muskets, we're certainly using information or misinformation to attack the credibility of that news story, that editorial, tarnish the reputations perhaps of those that wrote it. So there are other tactics at play, but there is certainly this same kind of mob mentality that can emerge anytime we have controversial information or controversial ideas being pushed out into the public.
And I would say, things are obviously very different, but in some ways they're very much the same. And I was struck by the political polarization that was happening then. That we talk about it now as if the parties can't get along. Things have never been as bad as they are. Woe was us. We look back in the old days when everything was public service was such a different time and era. But it really wasn't, and it was just as brutal back then, much more so in many ways. You had the two major parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, and Hanson was was a strong Federalist and strongly against this war, and it was very, very divisive, and I would argue more divisive than probably anything we see today. So things change, but also they don't change at all in some cases.
Right. And so, and in some respects, too, one of the ways it was different is the mayor of Baltimore had very little control, it seems. There wasn't a real police force. You had to kind of rouse some local militia who were willing to go and confront these people. So how have things gotten better for publishers of even very unpopular or controversial editorials?
So Justin can maybe take the modern day answer in terms of what happened back then. It was remarkable because in those days you call it the militia and the city militia, and unfortunately in this case the militia was mostly the mob, and so many of the mob members were also members of militia. So when they tried to muster the militia, very few men showed up. Even the trumpeter refused to muster. So that was sort of the conundrum that the mayor was facing, and he was no fan of the Federalists either, and yet he was sort of tasked with protecting them. So it was a unique situation with sort of no-win scenario.
Yeah, I would say, particularly when it comes to media, I think we now have more of an acceptance that these ideas are going to be pushed out into the public. That's the role of media, to put different perspectives into play for people to consider. And you're not going to have this violent uprising every time there's a disagreeable thought or opinion. Outside of the media, I think just looking at the different ways that government acts to protect controversial ideas, you don't have to look any farther than the Boston Common a couple of years ago. You have this one organization that had some controversial ideas. They wanted to be on the Common, express those ideas, and then you had this large counter rally in protest. And what did the city do? They created this large buffer zone specifically to prevent any violence occurring between the two groups. So I think in some circumstances you certainly see a lot more. You see the government being more proactive in preventing that kind of violence and stepping in almost to a fault to make sure that what we saw in this book didn't happen here.
Right. There's a quote, too, that I want to highlight that even though it was said in 1812, I could picture someone saying it today. And this is one of the members of the mob. This is at an earlier riot where they tore down the newspaper building, and this Dr. Lewis, the mayor kind of wandered in there, Mayor Johnson, and this Dr. Lewis says, the laws of the land must sleep, and the laws of nature and reason must prevail. And so I can almost picture, people saying to heck with, your laws and rules today. It's time for
absolutely. It's
order.
Very similar. Again, I was struck in many occasions with the parallels that we see today. Obviously, when you call the police now, they actually come as opposed to then, they weren't part of the mob. So things have gotten a lot better. But that's a great example. And it really, that was the mob. It came 3 different times and tried to attack Alexander Hanson and silence his newspaper. And every time he fought back and tried to defend the freedom of the press. And I think, in a very small way, we owe some of the liberties that we see today because of folks like that who literally put their lives on the line to defend the freedom of the press. So you guys can do what you do.
Right, and the news of this, it got around, and even like the president commented on it at the time. What was the public reaction around the country when people heard about this?
It was very much mirroring sort of the political spectrum in terms of the Democratic Republicans very much thought that downplayed the mob and thought it wasn't that big a deal. The Federalists thought it was the most horrific thing that had ever happened in the nation's history, and they used it. They took advantage of it. They used it for their political purposes. Shocker. And here in Massachusetts, which was very much a Federalist hotbed at the time, Hanson was viewed as a hero because he was the Federalist standing up against the other party, standing against the war, which was very unpopular around here. In fact, after the mob happened, some of the Federalists tried to kind of rally around the country to help protect the newspaper and support it, and people took out subscriptions as a way of doing that. And in fact, one of the gentlemen who took out a subscription was a gentleman here in Boston named Paul Revere, 77 years old, still fighting the good fight after the Revolution, took out a $10 subscription to the Federal Republican.
To the Federal Republican
that was the
of
name
Baltimore.
It was the name of the paper, yes.
That's fascinating,
Yeah.
huh? And another thing that struck me about this whole episode is on the one hand, you had Alexander Hanson, newspaper publisher, but then the mob attacking him in many respects was led by rival publishers who they weren't really standing up for the First Amendment principles. They were saying, I oppose this guy. Let's tear down his building and maybe hurt him very badly in the process.
Yeah,
Has that changed much, Justin?
that's certainly something that jumped out at me is just the whole media landscape back then. You had very much a partisan press. Everyone was taking a side, it seemed, a political side. And since then, I think media has obviously evolved to now becoming, with newspapers anyways, being the paper of record and reporting the facts and being objective. But we've certainly now, I think, gone back a little bit anyways toward what we were back then, where we have more partisan perspective in papers. We have commentary masquerading as journalism, political commentary, and it's very difficult, I think, for the public to really distinguish, well, who are these objective journalists anymore, and who are those that are just giving this political commentary, and whose side is everybody on? And it's rare that you have media of all backgrounds come together and unite under the First Amendment banner. You saw a little bit of that recently with the Boston Globe and their campaign for we are not the enemy, in response to President Trump's declaration that media is the enemy of the people. So you certainly see in rare occasions that kind of collaboration among media organizations, but in my opinion, not nearly enough. And I fear that we are moving closer to a time where media organizations are taking more of a political stance and choosing sides, if you will.
Go ahead.
Well, I was saying back then, it wasn't just that they were ideologically aligned; they were actually sort of organs of the party. Hanson's newspaper was a Federalist newspaper. He didn't disguise that at all. In fact, he was darn proud of it, and he put it in the masthead. So that in that sense, it was very, very different. Although we do see a lot of ideological, more so now, with Fox and MSNBC, different ideological takes on the news.
And Hanson's original strategy here, after he published one very controversial editorial and his newspaper building was torn down, then he decided to publish another.
Basically double down.
Double down, but this time he holed up with a bunch of soldiers of sorts who were like-minded with muskets, and that didn't turn out that well for him or his compatriots, one of whom died. Just making sort of an analogy to today, how might newspapers be, and other news publishers or even opinion publishers, be more smart about how they react to mobs who might want to tear them down, metaphorically or not?
Don't do what Hanson did.
Do you have a good approach there?
Yeah, so I think newsrooms should be proactive and look to discourage mobs entirely. One program that we have, our organization, is we help newsrooms get out into the community and be more transparent about their work. I think a lot of problems arise because the public just generally doesn't have a good understanding as to how journalism works, what goes on in the news gathering process, that there aren't journalists going out to the street, speaking to people, taking what information they get, and then simply publishing it without any kind of vetting process, without any kind of editorial discretion. So we're encouraging newsrooms and helping them get out into the community and really explain how they do their work, the entire process from start to finish, and why that's so valuable, and really distinguish their work from some of the other partisan commentary that might be out there that gets confused with actual journalism. And I think the more of an understanding the public has as to what real journalism is and why it's so valuable, the less likely you're going to see that kind of emotional, uprising over a controversial story. Because even if someone, a reader, for example, isn't excited to see that story or may have a difference of opinion, at least they know the process that went behind it and that everything was done in good faith and for a larger good.
I think the internet is sort of. When you think about the paper edition of the newspaper, say the Boston Globe, you knew when you turned to the editorial page that you were going to get commentary. And when you're in the news section getting news. Online, that distinction is very much blurred. If you go to the homepage of Boston.com, BostonGlobe.com, you can't always tell they market, but it's less clear that here's the news and here's the opinion. And I think that does cause folks to maybe be a little bit skeptical more so of what they're reading, and so that's a problem that I've seen more. I think I've seen more of as we've transitioned to online news.
And you were or are also a small town.
So yeah, I was
newspaper
my family business, the third generation. Before I came into the legislature, I was a newspaper editor for 10 years. Obviously, at a small local weekly, so a little bit different than what we're talking about here. And so, I certainly, that was what actually drew me to this project. It was about Alexander Hanson, who was a local newspaper editor, who then went on to be a congressman and a senator, and unfortunately died at a young age. But so it was sort of drew me to that as a former newspaper editor, now turned legislator. I have no aspirations of his future, but it was a lot of interesting parallels that I enjoyed.
And did you ever have anything close to a mob
No, nothing
gathering
like
outside?
that.
and Justin, does this approach where reporters or maybe editors or publishers do go out and try to explain what they're doing to the community? Do you think that works in lessening sort of anger?
Yeah, that's certainly our hope. There was actually a report released a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago, by the Knight Foundation that looked into just how much trust, if any, there is between the public and the press. And one of their primary suggestions was to have radical transparency, pull back that curtain and show how news is made and show what news is, as opposed to that other kind of commentary, and take all those lines that have been blurred and clarify them for the public. And I really believe that the more of an understanding that people have about those lines, where they are, and how journalists do their job, the more respect there's going to be for the profession, and the less likely you're going to have any kind of violent reaction to something that's published.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's important, getting out behind the desk. I mean, Andy Metzger, journalist, I see you at the State House. I know you're a fair guy, and even if I don't always agree with what you write, I know that I respect that you're going to do a fair job. Sometimes when you don't know the reporter at all and you don't see them, out and about on the beat, that level of trust is a little bit less developed.
Yeah, relationships are extremely important. I speak to a lot of journalism classes, so undergrad. So these are students, young students that are just starting to get into the profession. And one of the things that I emphasize all the time is you've got to develop relationships with your sources, and these could be, members of the police department, for example, someone that you might otherwise have, an adversarial relationship with, but you have to develop those relationships. You have to maintain some kind of trust so you can do your job, do it well, do it without making any mistakes, but have a reputation for doing your job right, and doing it in the right way for the right reasons.
This is a great book, and there's illustrations and other types of things throughout. Do either of you have a part of this book that kind of stuck out to you that you'd like to, just spend a minute on talking about?
Well, as the author, there's all parts of it. I really enjoyed writing this. It began. I first learned that a small town in Massachusetts was named after a fiery Federalist newspaper editor from Maryland, and that struck a chord with me. Why was that the case? So many of our towns are named after Mother England or a Native American name, and in this case, the town of Hanson, which I represent, was named after Alexander Hanson. And so that kind of sparked this, basically a love affair with diving into this story. And I've really enjoyed telling the whole story. As we were chatting off camera, just the little details about, a cannon being willed in, or what the temperature was on a particular day. Those are the kinds of things that really, as an author, it's such a thrill to kind of to dive into and put on your detective hat sometimes and try to piece it all together. So picking just one piece is hard for me. I really enjoyed the whole thing. I guess the jail scene, really, with the massacre happened, is the acute point in the story, and frankly, the brutal. It's kind of a tough scene for folks because it is very, very, very violent.
And is that jail still standing?
It is not. No,
Okay.
I wish it was.
That was at the time the new Baltimore City Jail, right?
It had just been built. The Baltimore City Jail. Yeah, it was rebuilt about a century later.
And there was one fatal casualty in that jail massacre, right? This General Lingen, who has sort of a distinction as being. Do you want to explain?
Yeah. So when Hanson decided that he was, after the first attack, instead of sort of going back home and taking his ball and so forth, he decided he was going to reassert the freedom of the press in Baltimore. His parents had a generation before had fought for liberty in the Revolution, and he kind of viewed this as his chance to step up for the freedom of the press. And so he recruited a band of Federalists, and some of them were sort of compatriots of his that were his age. but he also recruited some more senior folks who had military experience because he anticipated that might be some blowback. And some of the folks a couple of folks that he recruited, one was Light Horse Harry Lee, who many folks may know as a famous general, father of Robert E. Lee, and another gentleman named James Lingen, who had been a hero of the Revolutionary War, had actually been captured and was stored in a British warship for over a year. So he was viewed as a elder statesman, a hero of the American Revolution. And so Hanson recruited these two gentlemen. And unfortunately, during the massacre, James Lingen was killed, and he was the first person killed. And in fact, later, flash forward to the late 20th century, and when the museum in Washington, D.C. set up their tribute to slain journalists around the nation, the first panel they put up was to James Lingen, who was killed in 1812 defending the newspaper from the mob. And in fact, at the time, First Lady Hillary Clinton spoke at the event, and she in fact invoked his name and talked about the Baltimore Mob Massacre as the first incidents where an American was killed defending the rights of the free press. So it's...
And is there a moment, Justin, that stuck out to you from the book, a scene? Well, you mentioned the canon, maybe aside from the canon.
Yeah, just the idea that a publisher would have to hide in a private residence surrounded by armed men to defend his right to publish under the First Amendment. Just that visual. Anyone interested in the movie rights, by the way? This would make a great film.
Manuel Miranda, Alexander Hanson, not to be confused with Alexander Hamilton.
And there's a lot of similarities because they're both Federalists. They both were in a duel. Hanson was in a duel as well.
Oh, whoa.
Yes, yeah. He almost killed a man. This is before this incident happened. He had written a nasty editorial about a captain in the Navy who had been in the Chesapeake, and Charles Gordon. And when Gordon came back, he challenged Hanson to a duel. The two men met in 1810, and just outside the Washington D.C. Boundary, and they marched off their 5 paces. They turned. Hanson got his shot off first and struck Gordon in the abdomen. And he did survive, but he never really recovered from the injury. So, times are different then.
Yes, yeah. So words have impact, but maybe people should cool it down a few notches before deciding that impact is enough to take up a musket or a cannon.
For sure.
Any closing thoughts from either of you?
Yeah, I think this book for me was a great reminder as to how far we've come as far as the First Amendment's concerned, our appreciation for it, and while we still have a tremendous amount of work to do, don't get me wrong, we've come a long way. I mean, when it comes to First Amendment jurisprudence, like those cases, all of that case law, those Supreme Court decisions that have framed the First Amendment in the way that we all see it today, I mean, those really didn't start happening until the early 1900s. So here at this time, the First Amendment exists. It's written the same way. Those same words are written as they are now, but it wasn't perceived in the same way that it is now. So we've come a really long way in appreciating all of the freedoms that the First Amendment has provided us, particularly freedom of the press, and we've done a very good job protecting it. And it was a good reminder that despite all of the challenges that we're experiencing today as members of the media, within our current political environment, we're still doing far better than we were 200-300 years ago.
Yeah, I think if Hanson had been alive today, and I'm sure the opposition party would have called him fake news, and those kinds of terms, and so it's instructive that things change, but they don't. But obviously, freedom of the press was just some words on the Constitution at the time, and it didn't have meaning until free press was actually imperiled, and this is during a time of war. When you're staring down the end of a musket, and you have to defend freedom of the press, it's a little bit different. And so the men and the women who did that back then, I think we deserve to look at their history and remember them and their contributions to the freedom of the press that you all enjoy and we all enjoy and appreciate, and it's contributed to the fabric of our nation.
Well, thank you both for a great conversation about matters historical and modern. Tell me, Rep. Cutler, where can people find this book?
So it's available in local bookstores and online, and I have a website, mobtownmassacre.com.
And did you mention you're also doing some upcoming readings of that sort
I'm
of
doing
thing?
some upcoming readings at local historical societies. I have a variety of them coming up, and I have a list on my website.
All right. Sounds good. Well, thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.